The city didn't notice the rift. That was the first thing that struck her, how completely ordinary everything looked in the seconds after the dimensional tier sealed itself behind her like a wound closing. No crater, no smoke, no screaming crowd pointing upward at the sky. Just a Manhattan-adjacent skyline buzzing with advertisement drones. A billboard 40 stories tall cycling through a Vought International campaign featuring a man in a cape whose smile had been professionally calibrated to project exactly the right amount of warmth. And down at street level, 8 million people moving through their morning with their eyes on their phones. Android 18 landed on a rooftop, silent as a thought, and looked at all of it without expression. She had been in the middle of nothing particularly important, a training session with Krillin that she'd been winning comfortably, a cloudless afternoon on a planet she understood, and then the air had done something air wasn't supposed to do, and now she was here. Wherever here was. The Kai signature of this world was wrong in a way that took her a moment to articulate. Back home, even ordinary humans carried faint traces of energy, small flickering candles of life force that her senses had long learned to read like background noise. Here, almost everyone registered as essentially empty. Flat, like reading a room full of furniture and being told it was populated. Almost everyone. 3 signatures stood out. One was nearby, perhaps 12 blocks north, moving fast at altitude, radiating something that wasn't Kai exactly but functioned similarly, a dense solar-fed power source wrapped in what she could only describe as profound emotional instability. The other 2 were fainter, one underground moving through what felt like a tunnel system, one stationary several miles east in a structure that hummed with technology. She filed all 3 away and turned her attention to the immediate situation. The billboard cycled to a new image. A woman this time, blonde, armored, expression arranged into heroic determination above the words, Starlight, America's sweetheart, a VOUGHT hero. Below that in smaller text, the 7, protecting the nation so you don't have to. 18 stared at the tagline for a moment with the particular flatness she reserved for things she found quietly insulting. She dropped from the rooftop. The street absorbed her landing without drama. She'd long since learned to arrive without spectacle when spectacle wasn't useful, and she walked. She needed information before she needed anything else. The dimensional breach had been clean, which meant Capsule Corporation's experiment had likely registered the event on their end. Bulma would be working on retrieval. The question was how long that took, and what this world looked like in the meantime. It took her approximately 4 minutes of walking to understand several things simultaneously. The first was that superhumans here were celebrities, not in the peripheral, ambivalent way that Earth's fighters sometimes attracted attention. These people were products. Their faces were on everything. Merchandise rotated in store windows. A child on a bicycle wore a cape printed with the face of a man called Black Noir. A woman at a coffee cart had a phone case featuring Homelander, the solar-powered signature she'd clocked to the north, rendered in golden heroic profile, one fist raised. The second thing she understood was that she was being watched. Not obviously, professionally. A man in a gray jacket had been packing her since the second block, not looking at her directly, which was exactly what someone did when they'd been trained to surveil without appearing to. A drone the size of a sparrow had repositioned itself twice to maintain her angle, and the earpiece visible on a woman pretending to read a newspaper near the corner was the kind of hardware that cost more than most people's cars. 18 stopped walking. She turned and looked directly at the man in the gray jacket. He stopped. To his credit, he recovered quickly, reaching for his phone with the practiced naturalness of someone trying to become instantly ordinary. She watched him do it with the patience of someone who had faced actual threats and found this mildly interesting by comparison. She walked to him and stopped 2 feet away. "You've been following me since Lexington Avenue," she said. "Either tell me who you work for or find something better to do." He stared at her, then he touched his earpiece. "Subject is, she made us, Yeah, already. A pause. She walked up to Morrison. Another pause longer. I understand that. I'm telling you she walked up to him. He lowered his hand from his earpiece and looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. Ma'am, my name is Agent Pearson. I'm with Vaught's Talent Acquisition Division. We registered an anomalous energy signature approximately 11 minutes ago in this grid, and we've been tracking the source. He paused. That would be you. Apparently, we'd like to invite you to our headquarters for a conversation. Would you? There'd be compensation involved. Significant compensation. He said it the way people said things they expected to land with weight. Vought takes care of its assets. 18 looked at him for a long moment. The word assets sat in the air between them. She thought about the billboard. She thought about the phone case. She thought about the child on the bicycle wearing someone else's face on his back like a brand. I'll pass, she said and walked away. He called after her. She didn't turn around. Behind her she could hear him speaking urgently into his earpiece, and overhead the sparrow drone repositioned again, and she let it, because it was useful to be underestimated while she was still learning the shape of a world. She found a diner, sat in a corner booth, ordered coffee she didn't need, and spent 40 minutes reading everything accessible on an unsecured public network through a borrowed tablet she'd offered to charge for an elderly man at the counter. She was a fast reader. By the time the coffee was cold, she understood the broad architecture of what Vought International was, what the seven represented, and roughly what the power ceiling of this world looked like on paper. The paper version of Homelander was impressive, invulnerable, supersonic flight, laser vision hot enough to cut through tank armor, superhuman strength that had never been formally measured because no controlled environment had survived the test. She thought about the last person she'd met who fit that description, and remembered that Goku had beaten him repeatedly across multiple timelines. She was not Goku. She was, by most measurements, considerably below that tier. She was also, by any measurement she could currently apply to this universe, operating at a level that made Homelander's documented feats look like a reasonable Tuesday afternoon. This was information she decided to keep to herself. She was still sitting there, turning the tablet over in her hands, when the diner's door opened, and a man walked in who was not following her professionally. He was following her with the barely contained hostile energy of someone who'd been making fast decisions for the last 20 minutes and had settled on a course of action that he wasn't entirely confident about. Big, British accent when he spoke to the hostess. A jaw that looked like it had been designed specifically to absorb punishment. He scanned the room, found her, and walked over with the directness of someone who decided pretense was a waste of everyone's time. He slid into the seat across from her, without being invited, and put both hands flat on the table. "You're not one of Vaught's," he said. It wasn't a question. "No. And you're not from here." She looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "Because Vaught's had eyes on you since you landed and they haven't moved to acquire you yet, which means you told them no and nobody tells them no." He paused. "Also you landed, fell out of the bloody sky from nowhere. We caught it on a camera we've got pointed at a different building, but the angle was good enough." He leaned forward slightly. "So, what are you?" 18 set the tablet down. "Someone who's trying to understand what kind of world this is before she decides what to do about it," she said. The man looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were doing rapid, unsentimental calculations. "My name's Butcher," he said, "Billy Butcher, and love, I've been trying to figure out what kind of world this is for a very long time." He sat back. "Maybe we can be useful to each other." 18 picked up the cold coffee and drank it. "Maybe," she said. "If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night." Butcher talked like a man who'd learned that information was currency and was deciding in real time how much to spend. He gave her the broad version first. Vought, the 7, compound V, the boys, watching her face for reactions the way someone watched a card table, trying to determine what she already knew and what landed as news. She gave him nothing useful to read. She'd been expressionless around people far more perceptive than Billy Butcher, and had never once been successfully read by any of them. When he finished, she said, "So the heroes are a product. Corporate asset with a cape and a publicist, yeah. And the people believe it. Most of them. Desperately." He said desperately with the specific contempt of someone who'd once believed it himself and hadn't forgiven his earlier self for that. Easier than the alternative, isn't it? Alternative being that the most powerful beings on the planet answer to no one and the only thing standing between them, and doing whatever they fancy is a PR department, and the faint hope they've got enough impulse control to avoid a lawsuit. And when they don't have that impulse control, then Vought buries it, settles, reassigns, rebrands. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. Homelander lasered a man in half at a campaign event 3 years ago. Witness count was 11. Current living witness count is 2, both of whom have demonstrated remarkable improvements in their memory regarding that evening. 18 processed this without visible reaction. In the world she came from, power at that level was genuinely rare, the product of lifetimes of training, alien biology, or divine inheritance. It carried its own gravity. People who reached it tended to have been tested so thoroughly by the process of getting there that most of the casual cruelty had been burned out of them, replaced by something more complicated. What Butcher was describing was different. Power handed to someone like a salary. Like a company car, with all the accountability of a company car. "What do you want from me?" she said. Honestly, he looked at her with the first fully unguarded expression she'd seen from him, which lasted approximately 1 second before the guard came back up. "I want to know what you can do, because Vought wants you, which means you registered on their sensors as significant, and anything that registers as significant to Vought is something I want on my side before they get their hands on it." "I'm not a thing." "No, you're not." He said it without apology, which she respected more than if he'd backpedaled. "But you're something they don't have yet, and in this particular war, that's a category that matters." She considered him. He was not a good man in the conventional sense. She could tell that within the first 5 minutes. He was the kind of man who decided the ends justified the means so long ago that he'd stopped examining whether that was true and had simply built an entire operational philosophy on top of the assumption. She knew the type. She'd been created by that type. Dr. Giro had looked at human beings and seen components. Butcher looked at the world and saw a battlefield, which was a different pathology but adjacent. What he was not was dishonest, at least not right now. Right now he was being straightforwardly transactional, which she found easier to work with than performed virtue. "Tell me about Homelander," she said. Something shifted in Butcher's face. Not fear exactly, he was too controlled for that, but the particular tightening that happened around a very old wound. "What do you want to know?" "You said nobody tells Vought no. He's the reason for that." "He's the ceiling, yeah. Everything Vought has is downstream of him. The brand, the contracts, the government relationships, the whole architecture. He goes away, the whole thing wobbles." A pause. "Problem being that he doesn't go away. We've tried." He said "we've tried" with a weight that implied a full history she hadn't been given access to yet. "What's his actual limit?" Butcher looked at her steadily. "Far as we can tell, he doesn't have one, not one we've found. We had a woman soldier boy, actually bloke, long story, who could neutralize suit powers temporarily, radiation-based. Homelander took a direct hit and walked it off in under a minute." He paused. "Why are you asking?" "Because you brought me here to evaluate whether I'm useful against him, which means you're already thinking about whether I could fight him." She watched his face confirm it without him saying anything. "I'm trying to understand what that fight would actually look like." And she thought about what she'd felt when she'd clocked his signature from the rooftop. The raw output, the instability underneath it, that emotional churn that powerful people sometimes carried when they'd never been genuinely challenged, when every confrontation had ended the same way for so long that they'd stopped developing the psychological architecture for uncertainty. Homelander radiated that. A man who'd never lost wrapped in enough power to ensure he never had to learn what losing felt like. She had fought people like that. The experience was usually clarifying for everyone involved. It would be informative, she said. Butcher stared at her. Then something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face, more like the ghost of one, the imprint a smile might leave if it had visited briefly and left. Christ, he said quietly, you actually mean that? I don't say things I don't mean. He opened his mouth to respond, and then his phone buzzed. He looked at it and his expression closed down entirely, the way a shutter dropped. He stood, leaving cash on the table without counting it. We need to move, he said. Vaught's repositioning. They've got 3 acquisition teams in a 6-block radius and they've stopped being subtle about it. 18 looked out the diner window. He was right. She could see the shift in the street's texture from here. The men in tactical plainclothes who moved with the coordinated deliberateness of people who'd been told to stop waiting. And above the roofline, just visible against the gray sky, a figure in a cape was making a slow banking turn that was angled with practiced casualness toward this block. Not Homelander. The signature was different, denser in a physical sense, less solar, more like compressed mass. A woman, moving at a speed that suggested she wasn't in a hurry because she didn't think she needed to be. Is that Maeve? 18 asked. Butcher looked at her sharply. You know Queen Maeve. I read about her 40 minutes ago. She stood. She's the second strongest one, yes. By a significant margin below Homelander, yeah. All right. 18 dropped a tip beside Butcher's cash. She'd taken his wallet during the conversation and replaced it, an old habit, a way of understanding someone's actual life through what they carried, and walked toward the door. Where are we going? Safe house, east side. I've got the rest of my team there. Your team? She pushed through the diner door into the cold air. Above, Maeve had completed her banking turn and was now descending in a long, unhurried arc that would put her on the street ahead of them in approximately 40 seconds. How many people? 4 plus whatever you are. He was moving quickly, keeping to the building line, using the scaffolding overhead for visual cover. Frenchie, Kimiko, Starlight. She paused almost imperceptibly. Starlight is Annie January, one of the 7. Yeah. She's still publicly a member of the 7. It's complicated. Maeve touched down at the end of the block with the controlled ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and she was beautiful in the way corporate mythology was always beautiful, constructed, maintained, the product of intention rather than accident. She looked at the street with calm, professional eyes, and then those eyes found 18, and something in them recalibrated slightly. The way eyes did when they encountered something that didn't fit the expected parameters. She walked forward, not aggressively, more like someone approaching an interesting problem. Hi, she said. Her voice was even, almost bored, but her hands were loose at her sides in the way trained fighters kept their hands loose. Vought would like to have a conversation with you. Someone already asked, 18 said. I already answered. I know. Maeve glanced at Butcher with an expression that contained approximately 17 complicated layers of history in a single look, then returned to 18. I'm not here to drag you anywhere. I'm here to tell you that the people you're about to go with are going to get you killed eventually because that's what happens to people who run with Butcher, and Vaught's offer, whatever they told you, is worse than it sounds, and she stopped, tilted her head slightly. You're not scared. No. Most people are scared when I land in front of them. I know. 18 regarded her with the same flat patience she'd given everything else since arriving. That must be a strange way to move through the world. Something flickered in Maeve's face. Not offense. Something older and less simple than offense. She looked at 18 for a long moment with an expression that had come unmoored briefly from its professional setting. "Yeah," she said quietly, "it is." Butcher touched 18's arm. She led him marginally and said, "We should go." 18 held Maeve's gaze for one more second. "I'm not Vaught's and I'm not his," she said, and the his didn't need a name attached to land correctly, and from the slight shift in Maeve's expression she understood exactly who it referred to. "When you're done performing, find me." She walked past her. Maeve didn't move to stop her. Behind her, she heard Butcher exhale as though he'd been holding his breath for the entire exchange. The safe house was a gutted photography studio on the fourth floor of a building that smelled like mildew and old ambition, the kind of space that had been something once and was now useful precisely because nobody looked at it twice. Blackout curtains, monitors running feeds from 6 different camera positions, a weapons cache organized with the compulsive neatness of someone who processed anxiety through orderliness. And 4 people who stopped what they were doing when Butcher walked in with her and performed, in the space of 3 seconds, 4 completely different versions of the same threat assessment. The large one, she matched the face to Butcher's brief descriptions, went still in the particular way of someone with military training, hands away from his body, weight distributed, eyes reading her silhouette for weapons, and finding nothing that registered as conventional. The one called Frenchie didn't go still at all. He leaned forward with the bright, slightly unhinged curiosity of someone for whom danger and interest occupied the same emotional neighborhood. The woman beside him, Kimiko, watched 18 with dark, careful eyes that communicated several things simultaneously. That she was measuring her, that she was not alarmed, and that her own stillness was not the stillness of someone incapable of moving very fast if the situation required it. And then there was Annie January. Starlight in the tabloids, America's sweetheart in the Vought materials. Here, in a safe house that smelled like mildew, she was a young woman sitting on an overturned crate with her jacket off and her hair down, and she looked at 18 with eyes that were exhausted in a very specific way. The exhaustion of someone who'd been maintaining 2 completely different versions of themselves for so long that the effort had become invisible even to her, buried under the performance of normalcy. 18 recognized that particular exhaustion. She'd worn it herself once in the period after Dr. Giro, and before she'd made peace with what she was. The period when she was still deciding whether what had been done to her defined her, or whether she got to make that determination herself. "This is 18, Butcher said, which was not a name she'd given him but was accurate enough. "That's a number," said. "It is," 18 agreed. "You have a real name." "Yes." A beat, he waited. She didn't offer it. He processed this with the controlled patience of someone who had learned not to push things that didn't need pushing yet. "All right," he said. "Where are you from?" "Somewhere else." Frenchie made a sound of delight. "She is magnificent," he said to Kimiko, who looked at him with the fond exasperation of someone accustomed to his enthusiasms. Kimiko signed something with her hands. Frenchie translated without being asked. "She says you move like you're not worried about anything in this room." "I'm not," 18 said. She found an empty chair and sat down, unhurried. "I'm not here to fight any of you. I don't have a side yet. I'm here because Butcher found me before Vought acquired me, and that seemed like marginally better company for the moment." "Marginally," repeated, with a look at Butcher that communicated a long institutional history of "I told you so," deployed without actual words. "Don't take it personally," 18 said. "I don't give loyalty to people I met 40 minutes ago. I'm sure you're all very committed to your cause." "Are you always like this?" Annie asked. There was no hostility in it, genuine curiosity, slightly tired. "Like what?" "Like you've already done a full risk assessment on everyone in the room and found us all mildly interesting at best." 18 looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Is that a problem?" Annie almost smiled. "No, honestly it's kind of refreshing." She paused. Most people who come into contact with this group are either terrified or they're performing courage. You're neither. I've met things worth being terrified of, 18 said. This room isn't one of them. She let that sit for exactly 1 second before adding, with a flatness that prevented it from being insulting. That's not a criticism. It's context. Butcher had moved to the monitors and was pulling up feeds with the focused efficiency of someone shifting modes. Vaught's acquisition teams pulled back after the Maeve interaction. They'll regroup and come back differently, less visible, more targeted. We've got a window. He turned. I want to understand what we're working with before that window closes. So, he looked at 18 directly. Show us something. She looked back at him. No. No. You don't get a demonstration. I'm not auditioning. She crossed her legs and regarded him with the patient immovability of someone who had genuinely unlimited time. If you want to know what I can do, ask me. I'll tell you the truth, but I don't perform for evaluations. The room was quiet. And Butcher exchanged a look. Then said carefully, okay, what can you do? I'm a cyborg. My energy core doesn't deplete, I don't get tired, I don't run out of power, I don't need to rest between engagements. My physical strength and speed are substantially beyond anything I've seen documented about any super in this universe, including Homelander, though I'll reserve final judgment on that until I have more data. She said all of it in the same tone someone might use to read off a grocery list. I can fly. I can project energy at a range and intensity that would cause significant structural damage to most buildings I've seen today. I don't have a meaningful vulnerability that this universe has yet demonstrated the capacity to exploit. The room absorbed this. Frenchie broke the silence first, as she suspected he would. Mondia, he said softly. You're stronger than Homelander, Annie said. Not a challenge. She was doing the same rapid recalibration 18 had watched Maeve do on the street, that particular adjustment people made when the map they'd been using turned out to be the wrong scale entirely. Probably, I don't know for certain, I've never met him. Trust me, Annie said, with a flatness that carried an entire history of proximity to something that had frightened her for a long time. He's going to want to find out. I know. 18 looked at the monitors. Vought Tower was visible in one feed, its upper floors lit against the gray sky, that enormous logo catching the light. He already knows I exist. Your surveillance infrastructure isn't subtle, which means he's already decided what he thinks I am. What do you think he's decided? Asked. Either a rival or a resource. There's no third category for people like him. She paused. He'll try the resource angle first because it's more efficient. When that doesn't work, he'll reassess. And when he reassesses, Butcher said, we'll need you ready. For what specifically? For the possibility that we need him gone. The directness of it landed in the room with the weight such statements always carried, the acknowledgement of something everyone present had been circling for a long time, now said aloud plainly by someone with no stake in the particular dance they'd all been doing around it. Set down the tool he'd been holding. Annie looked at the floor. Kimiko watched 18's face. I'm not an assassin, 18 said. I don't kill for other people's agendas. Even if the agenda is stopping someone who kills civilians for fun. Even then, until I've made my own assessment. She met Butcher's eyes steadily. I told you, I don't have a side yet, I'm watching. How long does that take? She thought about the billboard on her first block, the child on the bicycle. The professional, calibrated warmth of Homelander's smile rendered 40 stories tall for a city that had been conditioned to look up at it and feel safe. She thought about Maeve's face in the moment before the professionalism had slipped, the something flickering underneath that looked very much like a person who had been performing a role for so long they'd half forgotten the original. She thought about what it meant to have power in a world that had decided power was a commodity, and what happened to the people that power was supposed to protect when the commodity model took precedence over everything else. Not long, she said. Her attention shifted to a monitor in the corner that had just changed feeds automatically, a rooftop camera somewhere midtown, and on the rooftop, standing with his cape moving in the wind with the precise drama of something that had been practiced until it looked natural, was Homelander. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking out over the city with an expression that from this distance an angle looked like pride or ownership. And the difference between those two things, she reflected, was exactly the problem. He turned, and for a half-second his gaze seemed to find the camera directly, which was probably coincidence and felt like anything but. Beside her, Annie had gone very still. "He knows where we are?" 18 asked. "Not yet," Butcher said, but the certainty in his voice had a hairline fracture in it. 18 watched Homelander on the monitor for another 3 seconds. "He will," she said. It wasn't a prediction delivered with alarm. It was just accurate, the way weather observations were accurate, neutral, inevitable, and useful to factor into your plans. She stood and walked to the window, keeping back from the glass, and looked out at the city that belonged to him in every way that mattered and in no way that should. She was beginning to form an opinion. He came alone, which was the most honest thing about him. Not because he preferred it, though he did, in the way that people who had never genuinely needed anyone preferred solitude to the complicated mathematics of dependency, but because sending others first would have implied that he wasn't sure, and Homelander was constitutionally incapable of implying uncertainty. He landed on the roof of the building across the street from the safe house at 11:14 in the morning, with the unhurried precision of a man who had decided the conversation was happening on his schedule. And he stood there for exactly long enough to be seen before he stepped off the edge and drifted across the gap, as though gravity was something that happened to other people. 18 watched him come through a gap in the blackout curtain. Behind her, the room had changed texture entirely. Had moved to the weapons cache with the controlled urgency of someone who understood intellectually that the weapons were insufficient and was reaching for them anyway because the alternative was standing empty-handed, which was worse. Frenchie was pulling Kimiko toward the secondary exit with quiet, rapid French. Annie had stood up and her hands were generating light at the edges, the white-gold photon energy she'd explained briefly in the preceding hours, bioelectric absorption and projection, useful, genuinely impressive by this universe's standards. And her face had gone into a configuration that 18 recognized as the expression of someone who had been afraid of a specific thing for a very long time, and had decided that this was the moment they stopped showing it. Butcher had gone absolutely still in the center of the room, with an expression like a man watching the specific nightmare he'd been having for years walk through the door in daylight. "Everyone stay in the building," 18 said. "That's Homelander," said, with the tone of someone who felt that this fact was not receiving adequate weight. "I know," she moved toward the door, "stay in the building. You can't just—" She was already on the stairs. She came out onto the roof access and walked into the gray midday light, and he was already there, having come through the roof door from the other side with the casual disregard for locked mechanisms that she supposed came naturally when your hands could reduce the mechanism to vapor. He was taller in person, broader. The suit was immaculate in a way that suggested either obsessive maintenance or technological assistance, and his face was arranged in the particular configuration she'd studied on billboards and in news feeds for the last several hours. That engineered warmth, that calibrated approachability, the smile that had been focus grouped and refined until it produced the optimal neurological response in the maximum percentage of viewers. It didn't produce that response in her. He looked at her with blue eyes that were doing something more complicated than the smile suggested, reading her, she thought, in the way that powerful people read new things, that rapid intake of information designed to produce immediate categorization. Threat or asset, rival or resource. She'd predicted this exactly. "So you're the anomaly," he said, His voice was warm and even and had the slight projection of someone who'd spent years speaking to crowds. "I have to say, in person you're not what I was expecting." "What were you expecting?" "Someone who looked more," he gestured vaguely at the air, "remarkable. For the readings Vaught's equipment picked up, I expected something more visually impressive." The smile stayed perfectly in place. "No offense." "None taken," she said. "Appearances aren't really my area." He walked a slow half-circle to her left, not close, not aggressive, the movement of someone who was used to being the most dangerous thing in any space and had developed a particular choreography around that fact, the orbit of a planet that had forgotten other gravity existed. "You turned down our acquisition team." "Yes. And you've been spending time with some people I find extremely tedious." "Butcher's team, yes." He stopped moving. The warmth in his expression had developed a new quality, not gone but thinned slightly like paint applied over something darker. "Here's the thing, I've been doing this a long time. I know every type of powered person there is. And most of them, when they show up somewhere new, they want the same things: recognition, resources, protection, a place in the structure." He tilted his head. "So what do you want?" "To understand the world I'm in before I decide what to do about it," she said. It was what she'd told Butcher, and it was still true. "And what have you understood so far?" She looked at him with the same flat patience she'd given everything since arriving. "That the most powerful person in this world has never been meaningfully challenged, and that this has had consequences." Something moved in his face. Not anger, not yet. More like the very early registration of a sensation he hadn't felt in a long time and didn't have fully mapped vocabulary for. "You think you could challenge me?" "I think the question of what you do when someone finally could is more interesting than the physical comparison." The smile was gone now. Not replaced by hostility, replaced by something more unguarded than either warmth or hostility, something that looked almost like genuine attention, the focus of a person who had been spoken to as though they were real rather than symbolic for the first time in a considerable while. He studied her with an intensity that had dropped all its professional calibration. "You're not afraid of me at all," he said. "No." "Why not?" She considered the honest answer. "Because I've met things that could end me and I know what that feels like. You don't feel like that." She paused. "I could be wrong. I'm keeping that open." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved his cape with its practiced drama and he seemed briefly unaware of it, which was the most genuine she'd seen him. Then, "What if I told you that this world needs someone like you in the structure? Not Vaught's structure, mine. What I'm building." The warmth was coming back, but different now, more direct, less manufactured. "You said you want to understand this world. I am this world. At least the part that matters." "The part that matters to you," she said. His jaw tightened. "The part that functions, the part that keeps 8 billion people from tearing each other apart." He stepped closer, not threateningly, almost compulsively, the movement of someone who decided proximity would be persuasive. "I've kept this world safe when no one else could, when governments failed, when other sups cracked. I held it together. While killing civilians." The air changed. It was subtle, a pressure shift, a temperature drop at the edges. The particular atmospheric response to a very large amount of energy reconsidering its containment. His eyes didn't change color, but they changed quality. Something igniting in the blue depths that she recognized as the look of a person who had never been directly accused out loud by someone standing close enough to touch, and had no prepared response for it. "That's a complicated characterization of events, that." "It's what happened," she said. "I'm not interested in the characterization." The energy in the air climbed another degree. She let her own energy core cycle up fractionally in response, not aggressively, the way you'd adjust your weight distribution before something physical, automatic and calm. The readout of her own power settling into active status was something she'd long since stopped noticing consciously. He noticed it. She watched him notice it, watched the precise moment when whatever his compound V-enhanced senses used to read power output delivered information that his expression couldn't fully contain. The thinning wasn't subtle this time. For exactly 2 seconds, something moved through Homelander's face that was entirely unscheduled and unconstructed, a raw data response to a reading that didn't fit his existing model of the world's hierarchy. Then it was gone, buried under a reconstruction of composure that was genuinely impressive in its speed. "You're stronger than you look," he said. His voice was level. "Most people are," she said, "when they stop performing." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him making calculations, not physical ones, though those were happening too, but strategic ones, the kind that determined whether the correct move was to escalate now or to step back and restructure the approach. She watched him decide. "I'm going to give you time," he said finally, "to see how this world actually works, up close." He stepped back, that engineered ease returning to his bearing like a tide coming in. Not Butcher's version, not Vaught's press release, the actual thing. He looked at her with an expression that had reconfigured itself into something that was possibly the closest he got to sincerity. "When you've seen it, we'll talk again." He stepped off the roof edge and was gone, a receding shape against the gray sky, cape catching the wind. 18 stood alone on the roof for a moment. She had learned several things. That he was dangerous in ways that weren't entirely physical. The manipulation was skilled, the emotional intelligence sharper than his mythology suggested, the charm a more sophisticated instrument than the billboards implied. That the crack she'd seen in his composure at the power reading was real and significant. That he was not going to leave her alone. And that somewhere in the exchange, underneath the engineered warmth and the strategic calculation and the genuine menace, she had glimpsed something that complicated the simple architecture she'd been building of him. A person who had been told since before he could form independent judgment that he was the most important thing in existence, and who had consequently never developed the interior structure that came from being ordinary, from being wrong, from being vulnerable and surviving it. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she filed it away, because understanding a thing completely was always more useful than hatting it cleanly. She went back downstairs. She gave herself one more day. Not because she needed the time to decide. The decision had been assembling itself quietly since the billboard on the first block, since the word assets in the mouth of a man in a gray jacket, since Maeve's face doing that unscheduled thing on the street, since Annie January sitting on an overturned crate looking like someone who had been performing a version of herself for so long she'd started to forget what the original felt like. The decision had been there, structural and quiet, waiting for her to stop observing and acknowledge it. She gave herself one more day because she wanted to see the city the way it actually was. Not through Butcher's operational lens, not through Vaught's curated feeds, not through the boy's justifiable but tunnel-visioned hatred. She wanted the ground-level version, the texture of a world that had been shaped by the existence of publicly owned gods and had organized itself accordingly. She walked for 6 hours. She rode the subway. She sat in a park and watched a father explain to his small daughter why Homelander was the greatest hero who had ever lived, pointing at a Vought poster on the park fence with the earnest conviction of someone passing down religion. And the daughter looked at the poster with wide, credulous eyes and nodded with the total trust of someone who had not yet learned that the things adults told you about power were often the things adults most needed to believe themselves. She sat in on a community board meeting in a church basement where residents of a neighborhood that had been on the receiving end of a Vought-adjacent disaster 3 years ago were still trying to get documentation that the company had thus far successfully buried. She watched a man in a 7-branded jacket get upgraded to first class on a public transit system because a gate agent recognized the logo and the implied association with consequence. She saw a world that had been taught to look upward and be grateful for what it saw. A world that had organized its entire relationship with safety around the assumption that the things looking back down at it from that height were trustworthy, because the alternative, that they weren't, that the height itself was the problem, was a restructuring too total to contemplate while you were trying to get through your day. She came back to the safe house in the early evening and told them she'd made her decision. The room received this with various textures of response. Butcher went immediately practical, pulling up maps and operational timelines, already building architecture around a conclusion he hadn't heard yet. Crossed his arms and waited with the steady patience of someone who had learned that Butcher's momentum sometimes needed a human counterweight. Frenchie and Kimiko sat close together, Kimiko's hand near his, and watched her with the attentive calm of people who had decided to trust the read they'd done on her in the first 20 seconds, and were waiting to see it confirmed. Annie looked at her with eyes that were doing something complicated, hope operating under significant caution, the particular configuration of someone who wanted something to be true, and had been burned enough times by wanting things to be true that the hope was heavily armored. "I'm not joining your operation," 18 said. Butcher looked up from the maps. The room tensed in various ways. "What I'm going to do," she continued in the same level tone, "is what I would do in any world I landed in. I'm going to address the most immediate source of harm to the largest number of people, using my own judgment about what that means on my own timeline, without taking orders from anyone in this room or anywhere else." She looked at Butcher specifically. "That's not a negotiation. It's information. And if what your judgment concludes and what our operation needs happen to overlap," Butcher asked, with the careful neutrality of someone who had already decided this was acceptable and was trying not to show it too quickly, "then we're moving in the same direction for our own reasons. That's different from you directing me." "Fine," he said, with a speed that confirmed he'd already accepted this. "What does your judgment conclude?" "That Homelander is the central problem. Not because Vought isn't also a problem, the institutional architecture is arguably more durable than any individual, but because the institution's capacity to operate the way it does depends entirely on him as both instrument and symbol. Remove that and the structure has to rebuild from a different foundation. One that's more visible, more accountable." She paused. "Possibly. I'm not naive about institutions." "Remove him," said. "You mean kill him?" "I mean remove his capacity to harm people without consequence. What form that takes depends on what's actually possible." She had thought about this carefully during her 6 hours of walking. She was not in the business of killing. She had her own history with that line, and where it sat and why, and it wasn't a history she intended to renegotiate for someone else's operational convenience. The goal is a world where the people in that church basement can get their documentation. Where that father in the park is telling his daughter something that's actually true. Where the woman who looked at me from a coffee cart this morning because I was walking without deference to the implied hierarchy of this place can do that without it being an act of low-level courage. She looked around the room. That's the goal. The method is secondary. Annie was looking at her with an expression that had come fully unarmored for the first time since 18 had met her. Something in it that was very close to the thing people felt when they'd been carrying a weight alone for so long that the sight of someone else acknowledging the weight existed, not even offering to take it, just seeing it, produced a response they hadn't fully anticipated. "How?" Annie asked. "He came to me," 18 said. "He offered me a look at how the world actually works by his measure. I'm going to take him up on it." The room understood this before she explained it further. Butcher's eyes sharpened. Frenchie made a sound that was not quite a word. Kimiko signed something that Frenchie, for once, didn't translate immediately, as though it was private. "You're going inside," Butcher said. "For a limited time, on my terms." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to understand clearly that I am not your asset inside Vought. I'm not gathering intelligence for your operation. I'm gathering it for myself to inform my own judgment. But if you happen to, I won't be passing information to you, Butcher." He closed his mouth, opened it again, closed it. This, she observed, was genuinely difficult for him. the acceptance of a useful thing operating entirely outside his control. And she watched him work through it with the visible effort of someone doing something against their fundamental nature, through sheer pragmatic necessity. "Right," he said finally. She contacted Homelander's people through a VOT channel she'd identified during her network access the previous day, the one used for talent relations rather than acquisitions, a distinction that mattered and that she'd chosen deliberately. The response came in 40 minutes. A meeting, the following morning, at VOT Tower. Her terms accepted, which she noted did not necessarily mean her terms respected, only that he was smart enough to agree to things provisionally. She spent the night in the safe house because leaving for a hotel would have required engaging with VOT's infrastructure more than was useful, and the boys' location was already compromised in ways they were somewhat aware of, and she was fully aware of. She slept for 4 hours, not because she needed it physiologically, but because she'd found over the years that the ritual of sleep had value independent of the biological requirement, a way of marking time that had its own clarifying function. She woke before anyone else and stood at the gap in the blackout curtain and looked at the city in the early gray of pre-dawn. Somewhere out there Maeve was either sleeping or not sleeping, managing the weight of the version of herself she'd agreed to maintain inside a structure she'd long since stopped believing in. Somewhere Homelander was awake. She was somehow certain of this, that he was one of those people who met the dark hours in a particular kind of alone, the specific solitude of someone surrounded by subordinates and therefore profoundly isolated. She thought about what he'd said on the roof, "I am this world." She thought about the father in the park and the daughter with the wide, believing eyes. She thought about what it meant to be powerful in a place that had never developed the framework for accountability, because the power had always been too total, too immediate, too godlike to fit inside the ordinary structures designed for ordinary dangers. Then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking had reached its useful limit and what came next was action. She heard Annie wake behind her, the careful quiet of someone who'd learned to move without sound in spaces where sound could be a liability. And then Annie was beside her at the curtain, looking out at the same pre-dawn city, not saying anything. After a while Annie said, "He's going to try to make you into something you're not." "I know," 18 said. "He's very good at it. He's had a lot of practice." "I know that too." She looked out at the city. "He hasn't met anyone who didn't need something from him. That's the whole architecture of his influence. Everyone who gets close needs something: protection, status, resources, approval. He knows how to find the need and work it." She paused. "I don't need anything from him." Annie absorbed this. "That actually scares me more," she said quietly, "because he's going to know that immediately, and I don't know what he does when the usual leverage doesn't exist." 18 considered this. It was the most genuinely useful thing anyone had said to her since she arrived. Not tactical information, not power comparisons, but a real observation about the specific shape of the danger, delivered by someone with direct longitudinal knowledge of it. "Neither do I," 18 admitted. "I suppose we'll find out." The city lightened by degrees outside the window, the gray warming toward the pale gold of a morning that VOT's media division would probably describe, if the weather cooperated, as another beautiful day under the Seven's protection. On a rooftop 3 blocks east a billboard cycled to Homelander's face, that engineered warmth catching the first light, 40 stories of constructed reassurance aimed at a city that had been taught to need it. 18 let the curtain fall back into place. Whatever the tower held, whatever version of himself Homelander had decided to present, whatever the institution had built to process and contain and commodify power, she would walk through it the same way she'd walked through everything since the dimensional tier had deposited her in this world. Without performance, without leverage anyone could locate, without the need for approval from a universe that had organized itself entirely around the distribution of that approval from a very great height. She had been made into something without her consent, once. She had spent years afterward deciding what that something actually was, underneath the making. She knew the answer now, had known it for a long time. No corporation was going to re-answer it for her. No manufactured god was going to reopen the question. She picked up the jacket she'd acquired on the second day and shrugged it on and checked the internal calibration of her energy core, the way someone else might check that their phone was charged, automatic and unhurried. Everything operational, everything steady. She walked to the door. Behind her, the city continued its slow brightening, and somewhere above it, a man who had never been told no by anything that could make it stick was waiting to see what she was. She was going to show him. On her own terms, at her own pace, in her own way, which was the only way she'd ever done anything, and the only way she intended to start. Word count, 1,800. The dimensional breach that had deposited Android 18 into a world of manufactured gods had been, by any measure, an accident. What she had made of it was anything but. She had walked into a city built on deference and walked through it without performing a single gesture of it, had looked at the most dangerous man alive and found him, not harmless, never harmless, but legible, which was its own kind of power. The tower awaited. Homelander awaited. The entire architecture of a world that had never been asked to account for itself awaited, humming with the quiet anxiety of a structure that sensed, without being able to name it, that something had arrived which did not fit the load-bearing assumptions it had been built on. The boys would continue their operation. Maeve would continue her performance, or perhaps, having seen something on a street corner that she hadn't expected to see, she would begin the slow interior renegotiation of what performance she was still willing to sustain. Vought would attempt to acquire, contain, rebrand and commodify. And somewhere beyond the dimensional barrier, in a world where power had been earned through fire and loss and relentless becoming, a retrieval signal was slowly, patiently building toward the frequency that would bring her home. She had time. Not unlimited time, but enough. Enough to do what she decided needed doing in this city of borrowed gods and genuine people caught between them, looking up, always looking up. At faces on billboards that may have been about to change. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. More stories await.